Hello, welcome to the Family Law Cafe podcast. I'm delighted that we have today Ranj Chall. He is an adult mental health worker. He's a senior practitioner. He's been in the field for over 20 years. He will deal with crisis management. He deals with family therapy. He will be there doing assertive outreach work. And what I really want to hone in on once we've introduced him is his thoughts on men's mental health going through separation. In my view, it's a really big area and an area that we see a lot of at Family Law Cafe. So Ranj, tell us about yourself.
Hi. As Joanna's introduced me, my name's Ranj. I worked in mental health for 20 years, worked in crisis work, assertive outreach, early intervention, you name it, I think I've done it. Still here to tell the tale. Mental health isn't the only thing that I'm quite interested in. I'm interested in literature, writing, arts, all things punky funky, all things alternative. So I think they go hand in hand with working with people of diverse cultures, diverse backgrounds, and sort of changing identity of England and all the different myriad of people that are here. So yeah, I think you have to bring a lot of different things into your life to work with mental health and to have, success with people and to help them through really difficult things. So yeah, I'm currently working on a series of articles on my website. It's a new company called Boggle and Shape. So it might be a good opportunity to bring in a little bit of discussion around those sort of things as well. Just to take the steer away from the idea of mental health. Sometimes it can be quite a difficult word to understand and people don't experience mental health and sometimes the way that authorities or clinicians think they do. So I think mental health per se, men's issues and women's issues, separations are, great areas of focus, but they need to be looked in a bit more detail to look at the slight nuances of how do we get in and help people at the right time. So great to be here, great to talk to you. As you know, I love talking to you, but rein me in.
Yeah, so Ranj, you've been in my network now, I don't know how, was it 5 years, 10 years, I forget how long.
Yeah.
And why I really wanted to bring you in to talk to me on this podcast was because I know that you've got vast experience in dealing with mental health issues, day by day. Mm-hmm. I know you've been through a family court case yourself.
Yes.
I know you've written a book, not in a completely different field.
Yes.
It's a work of fiction, and I know that you were offered book deals, and you are very passionate about what you do. You have a lot of amazing ideas.
Thank you.
So I think there's so much to discuss. So
you built my ego up now. I've got to make sure I deliver here.
So I think where I want to start is was there any reason that you went into the area that you cover?
Mental health?
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. When I was 15, I wanted to be a psychologist, and I really wanted to be a psychologist because I did experience quite a lot of issues in Asian culture when I was young. There was predominantly men were drinking. My dad was, quite a full-on drinker at the time, and I found it always interesting. Why does he drink? Mm-hmm. Then it led me to further ideas about why do people think the way they think. I think in those times it's typically like, well, a psychologist is the key player in all these, and it'd be good to understand psychology. So I got a book by Freud, and it was about dreams. So it kind of had nothing to do with social dilemmas. I think it was a famous book about dream analysis.
Yeah.
So I thought, let's figure out my dreams first of all. My sort of sleeping, night sleeping dreams. And thereon, I decided that psychology probably wasn't the right thing. I ended up doing an economics degree.
So you started, I'm going to grab a book by Freud.
Yeah.
Interesting. Did you read about any other psychologists? Or
Yeah.
I mean, obviously the father of modern...
Carl Jung.
Carl Jung, yeah.
Yeah, I got really into his a lot of his spiritual sort of teaching, his mystical teachings about psychology. I know he was the understudy of Freud. Mm-hmm. But my life kind of got spirited away, and I, did A-levels, ended up doing economics, and fell back into social work a little bit later on. Mental health social work was how I entered into mental health, and it was in a very sort of haphazard way. A bit like Carl Jung would say, life is a crooked road, and you end up being where you are in all sorts of haphazard ways. So it was a bit of misdirection, but I kind of ended up, I think, where I wanted to be when I was quite young, to work with people, try and understand why the hell do we think the thoughts we think. And I still find that as fascinating as I did when I was young.
And just touch on this, and I know you're very modest, but you offered, I think, a 3-book deal, weren't you, when you were younger? Did the first book?
Yeah,
and
I
thought,
did.
That's not for me.
Yeah, no, it was actually a really difficult decision. And again, got into writing by chance. I have to blame a friend of mine that I met at university, who didn't even encourage me, but I just ended up writing things, and it got acknowledged as quite, a reasonable piece of writing. And I just found the whole process of book deals, trilogy, not very organic or authentic to what I wanted to do. It was very much around marketing and selling ideas about maybe myself and my creativity that weren't very genuine. Yeah. So I had to rethink things and just be brave and think I can't quite accept this way of life for myself at the moment.
And so I know then you're writing now, and your writing is incredible. It's really deep. It's takes things that, relationship issues, and there's so much more depth to what you're saying than is just often out there. And I think it's incredible stuff, because obviously it comes from a place of that day-to-day knowledge that you have, and the fact that you are a creative writer. And so it's stunning. And you have a website, don't you?
What's it called? Yeah. It's called Boggle and Shape, and I've put some of those articles on there as a way of reaching, anybody. It doesn't have to be a specific audience. Yeah. You don't have to know how to read great articles. Try and make them a bit fun and creative, and I know the world we live in is so broad in terms of audience, education and understanding. I try and not make things very academic and make it quite creative and very honest, really, in terms of my experience as a practitioner, and very honest in terms of what I think are some of the problems in society and with people's mental health and with practitioners who try and help people, which I think is always contested and very interesting. I just feel very privileged to be part of that, and I think sometimes in mental health we don't share what we experience, and it's like gold dust, really, to some of the knowledge that we gain and the experiences. I think should be shared. I feel quite passionate about that.
Yeah, I mean, I feel really strongly about mental health, particularly men's mental health, because women, we know, tend to reach out more, tend to express, get more support, whereas men don't always do that. And the other thing I'd say is that there's a lot of writing out there by women about their issues, but obviously you're coming from a male perspective, your own male perspective. And I know there's issues of race that you bring in to what you're doing, which is yet another perspective. And I also know that you've been in family court and seen what that's like. What's your view of it?
Terrifying, absolutely horrifying, terrifying, destabilizing, stupefying. I'm a practitioner. I go into court to represent people, and I sort of thought, that's fine, it's a court case, it's just everyday sort of stuff. When it's your own personal circumstances, your own children, your own affairs, just suddenly out in the open, and suddenly you feel this omnipresence that decision making is slowly being taken away from you, is in the hands of people who don't know you, who are perceiving and analysing your life like it was some sort of soap opera. I found the mechanics and the processes of it really horrifying, and I think you were the part of that journey, and it was amazing to meet somebody that I could connect to in such an organic way. And I'd spoke to other law solicitors, and I'd spoke to barristers, and it was so scary because it was so sloganising in terms of my life. They weren't quite hearing what I was saying, and at that point I think I was really scared and worried about things that were happening, and you just got it. You had this hugely critical sort of way of thinking, but you just had this incredibly humane touch, but you just got it, and it reminds me sometimes in mental health when we go out and we see people who are in a crisis, and they have a myriad of issues, and they've probably seen 6 or 7 nurses, a couple of doctors, and people don't get it, and then suddenly they connect with someone, and it feels very organic and real. And so, going back to what you said, I think my experience, I was actually terrified, absolutely terrified. And opened my eyes that actually I usually represent people in court, and I feel very strongly about representing what's real for them, not what's subjective for me. But it really highlighted to me, the whole idea of being other people making decisions. I mean, it's just terrifying stuff.
Yeah, and about the most important things in your life, really.
Yeah,
about your children. And obviously the Children Act says that parents should make their own decisions, and court really is a last alternative. Obviously, because I work in the courts and work in that area, I know that often people go straight there, and that is not what the government want them to do.
No.
That's not what anyone wants them to do,
No.
and it's not the ethos behind the Act.
No.
So we're going to talk about some ideas that we have, or that you have, about different approaches. But I really thought it would be interesting to ask you what you think from a men's perspective and from a professional working in adult mental health, where you're dealing with a lot of men in crisis, as I understand. How do you think separations affect men? Big question, obviously. It's big breath.
But so important, so relevant, and I think the word relevant sometimes gets taken out of all things. So, in terms of my experience, not only in work but with friends and my own personal experiences, I think men genuinely handle separation in a really, really complicated and a very difficult way. I think most often in cases, separation it's a complete surprise to them. It takes them completely, it arrives unannounced. It's the elephant in the room that suddenly becomes reared up as it's this satanic force. And I think they don't expect it. And the way that begins a kind of crescendo of then situations that completely plummet men into horrendous experiences of self-harming, drinking excessive amounts of alcohol, not talking about how they feel, not talking about how vulnerable they feel, how scared they feel, and really thinking about what's caused this, what have I missed, where's my own critical analysis here. Things have gone wrong. I didn't see this. I didn't perceive this. No one told me this was coming. And men have this kind of like rabbit in the headlights kind of sort of presentation all the time. And in our service, we have referrals each month that hit high levels of people in crisis. The big topics are always relationships, separation, and men are high on the list. I'd say 90% of them are males who going down the road of substance misuse, self-harm, suicidal ideation. And a lot of it is not that it's simplistic, but it's just they won't talk, or they don't feel comfortable enough to find someone safe enough to say, this is what's going on. I didn't see this. I didn't know I was a rubbish partner. I didn't know that, my ex now is, she didn't care about this and she wanted to do these things. And it's unbelievable how sometimes the matters are quite sort of general and quite across the board. But I think also there's so many gender dynamics that men tend not to understand. They don't understand their role in the family in terms of how it may be negatively impacting on the children, actually on their partners. And I think all of this enmeshed becomes really complicated for men. I mean, we can dissect it more in detail, but the cataclysmic act of separation itself is really difficult for men. And I think you won't hear about the men who seek help, because they'll seek help and they'll avoid all these complications. But the majority of men won't access help. And it's been going on for years. Since I've been in mental health, there's been so many campaigns about talk to men, it's good to talk, and all these things. Even now, there's all sorts of, I think there's a campaign called Balls to Talk, where I think they're using the idea of football to try and get men to talk and stuff like that. So they use all these sort of tropes and euphemisms, alpha male tropes and euphemisms, try and get men to talk, but I don't quite see that men buy into that either. And I think it's got lots of things to do with tradition, how men think their role is in society. And I think we haven't got far from men thinking that they play this very stoical, very alpha male role in the domestic scene, in outside in society, where they can't say, I'm scared, I'm worried, I'm vulnerable. This doesn't make sense,
Yeah. And so there's so many points there. I want to pull you up on a few of them. Firstly, They don't see it coming.
No.
Why is that, would you say?
It's funny because, you know, obviously I love reading. I like to read kind of academic articles. In terms of my practice, talking to men, they all say qualitatively, soft data, you know, real hand experiences, didn't see it coming. When you look at the more academic high-end research, it says that women, and I think 90 to 80 to 90% women will terminate a bad relationship. And the majority of men will remain in a bad relationship, will have affairs, will do things that is counterproductive to the nuclear family, but they won't leave. And my own theory on this is the matriarchic bubble, that nurturing family, nuclear family, nurturing nexus that women provide to men, and it's a very safe place for men. They can find lots of nurturing, and without that, I think men really struggle. They struggle to self-create sometimes that matriarchic kind of bubble and that things that keep us nurtured and safe. And women are absolutely amazing and incredible at that. And if they ran the country and the world, I think we'd have peace and harmony. We'd have a much better place. But women often, it's all played out in the domestic role, and that's why I think when, you know, men can't see it because they don't see their it's a lot to do with their own patriarchal sort of beliefs and ideologies, how they go about each day.
Which they may not even know.
No.
It's just the role that they're in. And because obviously I see that, and we know that, I don't know if it's still the statistic, was 93% of divorce petitions when, you know, under the old scheme they were by women, not men. And also, you know, what I see is men tend to leave when they've got another relationship rather than being on their own. They don't seem to do very well on their own, and research shows that, doesn't it?
Absolutely. I think the fear of being alone, the social status of having to communicate to friends, family, you know, that I've been rejected, you know, that all isn't well at home, and I might be the reason why all isn't well. I think men love to present themselves as always showcasing great things about themselves and showing how fantastic everything is. And I think women are much more honest to other people outside family sort of bubbles, that actually things aren't great, things could be better. And I think women are usually encased in sort of some entrappings around, you know, the male and the female relationships, and the whole dynamics between gender play out in, I think, quite difficult, complex, quite vitriolic ways behind closed doors. And you only publicly hear about it when the idea, you know, you have to communicate separation. People are like, what? Thought everything was great, everything was fab. You know, and I talk to friends who obviously I have male friends, and there's so many generalizations about, you know, talking to their partners. And what I always hear is, they just don't get it. I try, but they just don't get it.
So even now, they can't talk to each other. I mean, even we've got books of men are from Mars, women from Venus,
absolutely,
and this kind of thing.
And they'll say things like, well, I don't know what she's going on about. There's no pleasing her. And, you know, we're talking about 2024, and there's so many movements around women's rights, you know, thinking about women's perspective, feminine perspectives, not women's perspectives. I think we're all, you know, victims of patriarchy, even men are. But I think...
Well, we don't hear about that, do we? We hear about toxic masculinity. What do you think of that phrase?
Toxic masculinity. I mean, masculinity itself is toxic, but is it? I mean, masculinity itself, what is masculinity? You know, and I think a great example was, I was at a social gathering, and it was quite young people as well. They were sort of in their early 20s, and they were like, it was really funny. One of the guys said, he's quite a good friend in some ways, and he said, do you think women have got it like all brilliant at the moment? You know, do you think it's all been done then? I'm like, what do you mean it's all been done? He goes, well, you know, women's rights and all that, it's all sorted, isn't it now? And I said, what do you mean? He goes, well, they go to work. He goes, yeah, they go to work, they've got loads of money, you know, men wash up. And he goes, it's all sorted then, isn't it? And we got into this massive heated debate, you know. But I think sometimes, you know, these things are really generalised in society.
But could I just pick you up? Because don't you think for that younger generation, there is, you know, some of the men are looking around and feeling a bit, oh, have I lost my role? Yeah, women can do everything.
Yeah.
Literally can.
Absolutely. I think, women don't need...
It's a great time to be a young woman, isn't it?
I think it's fantastic. I think this probably, it should always be a great time to be a woman. And, but I think at the moment, I think gender identity is so contested. And I think it's a really amazing thing. And it's so good for women. It's so good for young women. And it's brilliant because it's taken generations for us to get here and for women to actually say, look, we want to be heard, we want to be understood. And it's taken so much hard work. And people. But
let's keep to men. So
yeah,
just pick you up because we could have another few hours on that.
Yeah.
In terms then, during separations, obviously I see cases where you talk about men turn to drink, they turn to substance abuse, they have mental health issues. I mean, they are known as, is it still this phrase, a toxic trio? That in family law it will be, and those are then safeguarding issues about seeing their children, and then sometimes you get like a doctor's letter that it would help his mental health if he saw his children. And then obviously the family court is saying, yes, but we're focusing on the children's needs and this is a risk element. So any comments on that? They're in a difficult position, aren't they?
I think it's a really complex area because certainly the men that we work with and our team works with, it's just a standard thing that, they can't, or they, for whatever reasons, they're not seeing their children. That could be around their own perceptual ideas about fatherhood. Was I a good dad? Am I a good dad? Am I allowed to, now that I'm not living at home? I think men make their own...
Sorry, does that include them men that just walk away and don't see their children? Of course, I deal with men that want to see their children and, it's in the family court. But I guess I forget sometimes there's a lot of men that, and the statistics are very high, aren't they, that just lose contact with their children completely.
So much.
And why do you think that is?
I think it's, again, I don't think there's a straightforward answer, unfortunately. I think it's a complex myriad of intersectional things that happen. I think some men, depending on how they perceive themselves in the family home, you never know really how they feel about parenting and what their role is until they walk away. And they might think, I don't want that. I don't want to be responsible. And I was never valued. So I think sometimes there is that kind of knee-jerk reaction that I don't want this, I'm going to find a partner, I'm just going to get away from it all and let them deal with it. I think sometimes that does happen. And why they leave feeling like that, it's difficult to know. It's difficult to know what's been said and done between people, between partners. I think partners often, there's a lot of cross-contamination in terms of what they think about each other's parenting. I think that usually is a driver towards separation. I think some of those things can be taken very personally and very internalised. And when it does take place, I think men can lose sight of maybe that actually it's who's to judge who's parenting. Every parent is potentially a risk to their children in terms of what they do, what values they share with their children. And I think so. I don't agree with men walking away and doing that, but I think some of the reasons are they just can't. It's just they've had enough. I think other men will want to see their children, they feel they can't. One, they don't understand the law, they don't understand their rights. And again, I think it's quite medieval. I think they think, well, that's their role. It's the woman's role, and she ain't going to let me in. She's told me that I'm absolutely a nightmare, I'm drinking, I'm not safe. So I think men take it as verbatim what they've been told, almost a little bit like being at school syndrome. You've been told don't come back, and then I think they don't know quite what to do, who to talk to, and how to start that process of just getting back in contact with their children.
Because this is something that comes up.
Yeah, it's so basic.
I'll act for women who will say, I don't want to agree to contact because he walked away, the children haven't seen him for now 18 months. Where's he been? He didn't bother.
Absolutely.
And if there's an order, he's not going to turn up. And then, of course, that's heartbreaking for the children, and sometimes that does happen. But courts will promote contact because they know that in the long term for a child, it is an adverse childhood experience not to have a relationship with one of your parents. That children want to have that relationship. And so the court do want to help. And perhaps men may not realise that even if they are not the perfect person, they're still the father to that child. And the court will help them. And even if they have, say there's a fact-finding hearing, it's that things, the court isn't establishing facts to stop them seeing their children. It's saying, this is what happened, now can you now deal with that so that you can see your children. And in most cases, there will be an order that they do see their children.
And
maybe they don't know that.
And I think this is the basic principles that men don't understand, is that actually, if they even hear some sort of any auspicious towards courts, any rumour that this is going to end up in court or you're not a good parent, I think they're terrified that actually it might be a sense of guilt, they didn't do something here or there, but it gets so exaggerated and so it turns into a bit of a kind of psychological monster for them. I think it's that self-criticism when you're not in a relationship and that kind of safety net's gone and all other things about their status and identity has come crumbling down. I think just getting on a even level playing field to understand who they are, what to do, becomes really becomes superbly complicated for men.
Just to drop in, I think there's a real lack of trust, and I understand that. The men will think, and they're going to be judged. It's not a nice place to be, and so I think they may feel, I don't want to go through this. This is, and it's also because of the severe delays in the process. You know, it can be 2 years of litigation just to see your child.
I think just going back to what you're saying, that when men walk away and they don't understand that the courts want you to have contact, it sounds so simple to us maybe as professionals, but I don't think generally men understand that. I think that they think there's going to be a serious level of scrutiny and someone's going to unpack their life and say, you were awful here, you were awful there. Someone with a wig on is going to say, you know what, I'm not sure what you should be doing as a parent. You know, you've been absolutely bloody awful in this, that and the other. You know, and I think men don't understand that just consistency in contact is often what children want. At the best of times, I think children, you know, good parenting, I'm thinking back to my parents when I was young, and I think it's important to reference, you know, what parenting is under great scrutiny in the modern day age. It's only a generation away where I was parented by my mum and dad who didn't have an education. They came from a different country. They didn't go to parents' evening. They didn't help me with my homework. They were often working, and you know, they didn't do anything really special with me.
Sounds a bit like my
Yeah, I know.
My parents were always working.
Yeah.
I did say to my father when I was doing my A-levels, and he did ask me what I was doing, and I just made up something completely different. He said, okay then. And he had no idea.
Exactly.
I understand that. He left school at 13. So I don't think he even went to school before that. But so,
philosophically,
we may have had a
I think
similar experience.
Sometimes I think philosophically it's interesting because parenting is a modern day concept. I think it's been driven right through in the 70s.
My parents were so busy.
This is quite a modern day idea. And I think people think parenting and childhood is like a construct that we've understood for centuries. It's only a generation away where it didn't probably exist in the way that it does now. The level of scrutiny and detail and obsession over parenting is sometimes scary. You know, and like I said, going back to my parenting, you just wanted to see your dad. You didn't do anything special. I mean, generally, it's quite miserable. Mum was always much more fun. I hope my dad don't see this, but you know, I think sometimes I think men think in this day and age, like we were saying, there's going to be this huge kind of unpicking of their life, and say you've got to be.
To a certain extent, there is.
I think there is.
There can be the way that the processes have gone. And it's really important to remember that the court's looking at the welfare of the child,
completely,
and that there's either parent. I know we're focusing on fathers here, but either parent is so important to their child. And
hugely.
There are parents who are criminals, and that's fine. Well, not fine that they're criminals. It's fine to their child because they're still their parents. So, you know, obviously there are safeguarding issues. Just to move on to a different area. Thoughts on...
Just before that, I just want to give one example which I think is really important if it's going to help people. I worked in quite a lot of cases where there was significant safeguarding incidents with males. There was even physical harm and this, that and the other, which was obviously really concerning. But over time, through the courts, through mental health, through working together, contact was reinstated. And, you know, people are allowed to then become and get on with certain aspects and become still involved with their children. So I think it's important to remember contact still is important if it's appropriate and if it's in the interest of the children, but it can be achieved. So even the most dire circumstances, contact is still promoted, but in a safe and meaningful way. And so if it can be done in those circumstances, some of the cases that we get, they're not that difficult in terms of reinstating contact. Or men just thinking, I can't.
And I know you deal with family therapy.
Yeah.
So what I find in difficult children cases, that comes in right at the end.
It does, yeah.
So you might have gone through 18 months and then there's a guardian for the children and then there's a psychological report and that comes in, after perhaps contact's completely broken down. There doesn't seem any proper reason for that as to why the children don't want to see their father. And then there's a psychological report and then, and then I find so often that report says along the lines of have family therapy.
Yeah.
And so sort of 2 years into a court case, like maybe 10 or 12-year-old children saying we don't want to see our father. There's no proper, no sort of big thing has happened, or there might have been an incident, but it wasn't such that it should have had such big consequences. Tell us about family therapy. What happens there? And then my question after you've talked about family therapy and what happens is whether you have any thoughts on how there could be some more early advice in family proceedings.
Yeah. Family therapy, so in mental health we do very specific family therapy which is quite detailed and quite well attuned to quite a lot of complex issues with people with chronic mental health. So really it's a very structured, tailored program. I trained as a practitioner quite early on because I thought this is going to be really helpful. And what I really found incredible about it was that it really goes into the really complicated areas of that kind of nuclear family and what they can't resolve. So a key thing for me is that you explore communicating negative and complex emotions between each other, because that obviously has fallen apart and you can't do that. So we do specific areas around communicating negative emotions. Now, just thinking that alone, I think how many people are able and can confidently say, I can explore a negative emotion with my partner. It just doesn't happen because there's so much at stake. There's so much at stake sometimes to tell the truth of how you're feeling. So
crazy, isn't it?
It's
There's things
absolutely
that you'd say
ridiculous.
to strangers that you might not say to your partner.
And I think that's exactly. So what happens is we do it in quite a little bit of a theatrical way. You do role play, which takes away some of the gas of what's going on, and then people get involved in it. And believe you me, I've got involved in some of the most dysfunctional, complicated, violent families, and I thought this ain't gonna happen. But I thought I'm gonna still try, and I was amazed how much it happens. So exploring negative feelings, active listening. We've all heard of these great slogans. I mean, we're a culture that talks too much. How much do we listen? How much do we actually absorb, process, and activate when we've heard somebody say something? So we explore that in great detail, and problem solving. Solving a problem in the family, which becomes very complicated for families to do. So we look at that in quite a lot of detail, but also having the beauty, I would say, of also assessing each other's mental health and putting that into the mix. So what you then get is a great flavour of who can cope with what information at what stage. How do we allow people to learn, educate, and draw out better ways that they can communicate with each other? Because it's about the ideal form of education is not to tell people. How do you bring about a sense of autonomy? And that is through drawing out some of these things, not through hot topics, but it's done in a very sort of educative sort of theatrical role play. And you sometimes think it's not going to, but it actually has a huge effect. And I would imagine that the way we do family therapy and mental health, that could work incredibly well in family court cases, because it looks at all the things that probably need to happen at a very early stage. And it's really tragic that family therapy is always like the kind of last box that's ticked.
It's
really
crazy.
Yeah.
And by that stage, everyone's so damaged, everyone's so exhausted.
I mean,
maybe people have walked away.
It's fallout, isn't it? And
it's like the last resort goes.
Decisions have been made. Children feel disenchanted. They might not have seen mum or dad for 6 months, and they just think this is how it's going to be. And they've tried to adjust to a new life, and 6 weeks is too late. 6 months is tragic.
Well, 6 months is that will be
It's horrendous.
very minimal. It might be 2 years.
I mean, the impact on children, trying to deal with not only the fallout, but they have to go to school, they have to deal with friends. It's so difficult. And I think family therapy should be at the beginning. Let's put this on the table. What can it achieve?
Or what about some kind of mental health advising?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. At the beginning we have a safeguarding report by CAFCAS.
Yeah, you do.
Safeguarding.
Of course, yeah.
So then that's almost like a blocker, isn't it? Like, yeah, there's these issues.
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
we know we need to have that information, but there's no input from anybody like you at the beginning. And I just wonder whether if there was something active or somebody in the process early doors might have a chat with the judge, look at the papers and say, hey, maybe this should be diverted in some way rather than it dragging through the courts. I mean, what are your thoughts?
I think, it's so fundamentally important, and the skills that mental health practitioners in their nuanced ways bring in terms of understanding behaviours, understanding social world, the socio-psyche of people, not the individual psyche. I think the socio-psyche, family dynamics, we do this every single day, and we can clearly see where things are going to go wrong. We can see where things need to go. We look at the whole things around the impact of children, safeguarding. I mean, it's like we do it in crisis work all the time. I imagine that introduced at the front door, and I think maybe people's perceptions are even like the judge's perception of mental health. Everyone's going to think, no one wants to hear from a mental health worker. If you're young and cool and sexy, you might want to hear from mental health.
Yeah.
I think different generations have different ideas about what mental health is. But I think using practitioners and the skill and the knowledge doesn't have to be framed in mental health, but can give such great oversight. And I think they can actually be part of these cases and be there to not be mediators, but offer themselves to, to couples who have separated. I know individual solicitors represent each other, and it becomes a bit like, you're in this colossus battle, everyone's representing each other. I always feel that there's no one in the middle to have an impartial view, to say, obviously the judge takes an impartial view, but there's no one.
They're not in the middle, that's the whole
They're
point.
not in
the
the middle,
judge is up there.
Yeah.
So if the way I look at it is that you're dealing with probably adult issues, but you're looking at the welfare of the child.
Absolutely.
I've said this so many times, there are no problems with these children, but there are problems with the adults.
Wow.
Sorry, it is the adults. It's not, there's very, very rarely any issue with the children. The children are fine.
Very rarely. I think, like I said to you before, we've had children, it feels like it plays out like a Shakespearean tragedy. It has to go to this final act. People take it into court. Like it has to go through this drama for everyone to think, right, that's been said, it's been said officially, but there are so many opportunities to get things solved way before it even gets to this tragedy. And the children are rarely any issues with the children.
Yeah.
It's all about how things are played out. And some of my ideas that the conversation of a relationship seems to expand into areas in a really dysfunctional way, because I think couples or partners who are feeling rejected don't get answers, and sometimes I think it's very hard for people to think there is no answer that would make sense to me.
Maybe the answer is there is no answer.
There is no answer, and I think people, when I've worked with people in separation, they always want to know what happened. Was there one finalistic point? Was there this reason? Because we're so reason-esque in modern day life, aren't we? Everything's got to have a reason. I think often it's really difficult to find that one little point, that nugget, where everything will just make sense. So I think people drag these conversations into court. It's almost like I want to get one over her. I want to get one over her because she did that. I want to get one over him because he did that. How dare he do that? Yeah. Instead of
forgetting what it's about.
It's about, there's ways of dealing with that. There's ways, and not to say that they enjoy going to court. I think once people make the decision to go to court and they don't want to mediate, they themselves think, oh my God, deep down I know they're thinking, this is horrendous.
Well, I don't know, some people I think maybe do.
Do you really?
I think
really?
some cases. But we've so much to talk about.
Sorry, I've gone into Shakespeare now. Yeah. Couldn't help it.
Thoughts on co-parenting?
You've got me here. You've got me on the co-parenting.
I know you've got some thoughts about this.
God, it absolutely makes my blood boil. Not that, I don't...
But everyone says you should co-parent after separation.
I've thought about co-parenting for years, and I've often thought, who came up with the idea of co-parenting? Co-parenting is like this kind of slogan. This advertising campaign for this so-called gold standard of parenting. I've never read in the Children's Act anything that would say co-parenting. The Children's Act clearly makes it clear parental responsibility. That is what is key in children.
Each party has parental responsibility for the child. Absolutely. They should discuss matters.
Absolutely.
So, co-parenting seems to be agreeing things and acting in a certain way. What are your thoughts?
I'm trying to say that actually we should be focusing absolutely not on co-parenting. That is a red herring. Two people often separate because they can't agree on parenting. And that can be a huge issue for couples, for women alike, that they feel unsafe, they don't like, certain things going on in the household. So the parenting aspect of it can be a massive reason why people separate. Then what happens is when they separate, you get like family workers, and obviously there's not a personal criticism, but there's ideas that are put out to us. This is what you should follow. And I think sometimes practitioners don't critically think, trying to get two couples who are having a hostile breakup to then think of agreeing on parenting when the actual reason to separate was they don't agree. It's just so paradoxical. What we should be encouraging is, now that you're separate, how are you as a parent going to take parental responsibility? This is the law. This is your chance to show yourself, the world, your children, you are responsible and fabulous at it once you've given a chance. And the same goes. But I think...
So you can have two different styles of parenting.
Absolutely.
Because dad does it this way, mum does it that way. That's not necessarily wrong. I think we all know as children, we can remember back going, oh yeah, that's what mum likes, that's what dad likes. It's not really a problem. You recognise as separate people with different beliefs and attitudes.
I think the idea of, the nuclear family, I think when you're together, you don't know who's doing what. So it's just like, yeah, this is happening to us as children. You just think, yeah. When you separate, then you realise, oh God, yeah, it was dad who was, really good in that part. It was mum who does that. When I was young, you really knew what mum and dad were doing. They were never, ever had the same values to parenting. And you knew where you could go when you needed each parent for different things. As children, we can become a little bit strategic like that, can't we? And I think co-parenting is just dangerous to some extent. It's fine to agree, but you don't have to agree to be a great parent. If you can be a responsible parent and you can deliver great sense of parenting in your own individual idea of race, equality, gender, then it's fab. And I think when you look at dual heritage relationships, this is really interesting because you can have not only different ideas about class, but you can have different ideas about race, religion, values towards, and these things can get very heated when you're separated, and they can be the cause of separation. If one partner doesn't agree about certain ideas about ethnicity or a child's identity because one parent might be acknowledging it more, I think these can be really misinterpreted. So I think the idea of co-parenting tries to pull together some dangerous ideas when I think individual parenting and parental responsibility is so good for children because
and maybe respectful to the other. Yeah, they do things a little bit differently. They have a different beliefs.
Absolutely.
And that's fine.
And don't we want our children to be diverse? Don't we want them to have I mean, if you go back 100 years, you go into different cultures now, often the parenting is done in communities. Even now, the idea of PR and co-parenting, it never existed. Children are brought up by communities, by aunts and uncles. They all take a sense of responsibility. So I think, there are incredible ways how children learn, become autonomous, and are safe in different cultures. But I think we get so pigeonholed and so obsessed with co-parenting.
It's almost as if everyone wants a sort of one little code word that's going to work and then we won't have a problem. But life is not like that, is it?
I mean, it's cosy, isn't it, to aim at? It's boxed up, it's nice. It's easy as a practitioner to think, this is what we're aiming at. It becomes more difficult to think, actually, you know what, I'm not going to aim at that. I want to really pull this apart and think, this parent's doing that parent's doing that. And, there's so many influences as children. I remember, I'm indebted to my friends who helped me when my mum and dad couldn't. They stepped in. And I can't say that my parents always did the right thing and they always didn't give me great tips. I love them, but
that your peers are so important.
I'm indebted to so many people for maybe the person that I am, and things that keep me well.
On that note, I'm going to leave you now. I'm going to introduce you to Michelle, who is in my next podcast. And Michelle is a criminal barrister.
Great.
So she's going to have a whole new perspective.
Oh, wow, yeah.
She can ask you a few questions.
Okay.
She's a very experienced criminal practitioner, deals daily in the criminal courts with all the things that she does. So it's fantastic to talk to you. And I'm sure that there's so many other things that we could have covered, but we have to stop. So I do come back in the future. Okay.
Thank you.
Leaving you now.
Thank you.
Right. Well, Raj, that was fascinating listening to your interaction with Joanna to do with the family courts.
Yeah.
Have you had much experience in the criminal courts?
I've had a lot of experience assessing forensic assessments in the criminal justice system, not in the courts per se, but obviously when there's issues around criminal justice, we do work quite, it's quite a common theme in mental health. There's a lot of, not in the courts as such though.
That's what I was wondering, because certainly in my experience, the only time you come across mental health professionals is normally when someone is, for example, a paranoid schizophrenic and fitness to plead and all of those issues.
Sure, yeah.
Day on day, do you think there is a role for mental health professionals at court?
I think fundamentally, I think in terms of my work, I'm thinking of times where someone's attempted murder and you go down to the custody and you assess them under the Mental Health Act, because I'm also an approved mental health professional.
Right.
And then you do capacity assessment. You'll assess, is there a mental disorder here? And then you'll distinguish between, can they be interviewed for, the act itself, through the criminal justice, or does it go through down the route of mental health? So absolutely, and I think these things always change and move shape, and the people's capacity, mental health can arise at different stages of people being in the court. So absolutely, so much. And the issues around people feigning a mental disorder to try and get out of criminal acts is so common, and it often needs careful scrutiny with doctors and AMPs as well. So I think there's a huge role in the courts, absolutely huge.
Certainly in my experience, I don't know if you're aware of this, a lot of criminal courts now, as opposed to when I first started, now have mental health teams actually at court.
Right.
And therefore, if someone is having a crisis or develops a crisis, there's someone on hand, as you say, to ascertain whether this is really a crisis or just a way of getting out of the day.
And it's such a complex area, and we do, we preempt, things at custody, and if we do have to, but often we try and do some of the work before it gets into the criminal justice, and then it's usually but I imagine further down the line, if someone hasn't got a mental disorder, actually going through the criminal justice system, at any point that can change. And I think having mental health teams available at that time to be there is so important, probably to get things moving quickly in courts, get it out of court, or to pursue with the right kind of legal action. But I'd always say you need the right faces in mental health. Sometimes complexity of the work can be quite not minimised, but I think you just kind of need the right professionals at the right time as well. Because areas around capacity and mental health, sometimes it's very subjective around what professional has said that at what time. Can be very subjective in terms of people's experience. So I think that often needs to be considered, I think, quite strongly, who's there and doing what.
Have you ever been asked to lecture, for example, barristers who appear in court about mental health?
I've had conversations with barristers before, but certainly not in terms of giving any teachings or education around mental health.
Because certainly in my experience, you tend to have to learn on the job.
Really?
As much as you can. You don't get
That's fascinating.
Separate education about mental health. You just and some people obviously are more perceptive than others.
Wow, I find that really hard to believe. I mean, obviously we go to tribunals and courts in mental health under the Mental Health Act, and you have lawyers and solicitors who are trained in mental health and understand that those aspects. But that's actually really worrying. That's alarming.
Yeah. Well, criminal practitioners, unless it's changed, certainly post-qualification, I've certainly never been asked whether I'd like to attend a lecture.
I find that in today's kind of world really alarming. it's such a simple thing. I mean, we work with the police, we do training with the police. They're quite well attuned to orders. They pick up people on section 136 of the Mental Health Act. We do so much cross work with police, paramedics and other agencies, even the fire service now. We have loads of cases with hoarding, fire safety. We do so much collaborative working. How can we not do collaborative working with, criminal justice when it's such a big feature of mental health? Anyway.
I believe, and again, I may be wrong, but I believe that judges get better training nowadays.
Wow. Well, I'm here. I'll do a webinar.
Could be a whole growth area.
Yeah, I'll do. That is, honestly, I find that really hard to believe because it's such a nuanced area where there's so many crossovers in people's behaviours and why they do it. And I suspect, how can you separate those things sometimes without having expert opinions?
As I said, on the job.
Yeah, you learn. So it's almost
scary.
like you make it up a little bit.
Well,
you kind of make it up and it's whatever you think goes at that time, which, that's worrying, I have to say.
And unless you have a parent of a defendant or someone who can say, well, in the past there's been mental health input,
sure,
you're having to take instructions at face value.
And often gives, often carers get so tired of doing that, advocating, having to be there, wanting that role to be taken away from them. It becomes really difficult then for, even parents and carers to advocate all the time and be there at all these different junctures in people's trajectory, whether it be criminal justice or mental health or anywhere. It becomes very difficult for carers to do that consistently.
And certainly in my experience, in some cases, the parent or carer, normally the parent, may have mental health issues themselves.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. It can be quite common in terms of looking after people for years, not getting the right help. Carer break down, their own lives become quite compromised as well. And they don't realise it sometimes, but I'm really surprised.
Are you?
I'm scared.
Oh no.
Yeah.
I've unsettled you now.
Yeah, no, wow, that's a gap, and I think it needs to be filled, but it's good to hear that mental health teams are there.
Yes.
And, certainly sounds like the lens is turning towards having a more balanced approach towards people in the criminal justice system.
Well, one of the areas that, certainly again in my experience, is we're getting a lot more defendants that are ASD.
Oh my God, ASD.
And
Don't start me on that. Yeah, I can, because the influx in mental health at the moment for autistic spectrum disorders is phenomenal. It has been in the last 5 years, but the levels and it's unbelievable.
And what's been the best part of your job?
Wow, that's a great question. It's like such a simple question, and often it's great. I think the best way to say it, and I always talk about this in terms of when I'm mentoring other clinicians, is I feel really privileged to go into someone's house where they're experiencing so many difficult, complex and alarming issues in their life, and to be part of that and for them to share their world with me just feels like a privilege. In its entirety, I think that's what I enjoy, but I also feel very privileged. And if I can make a difference, we like to feel that we can make a difference.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, and that is often the motivation. But sometimes just sharing something with people, sometimes you don't know what difference it's going to make. And I don't want it to sound too cliched that, I do this job because I make a difference. Sometimes we do things that are not nice in terms of sectioning people, and you don't know what difference it's going to make. You have to make decisions. But I think being allowed to be part of people's lives in difficult circumstances is always a privilege. And that's the best I think the best experience I have is taking that with me each day, and being part of people's lives, I think is quite a special experience.